Welcome to this Brennan Center for Justice event. For those of you who don't know, the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute affiliated with New York University's School of Law. I'm Larry Norton, director of the Election Reform Program at the Brennan Center. We're producing this event with NYU's John Bradamith Center, which advocates for civil debate on politics and public policy, and NYU Votes, which strives to give every eligible NYU student the information they need to cast their ballot. Please visit nyu.edu/NYU-votes for lots of resources about registering and voting. Again, that's nyu.edu/NYU-votes. I'm thrilled to introduce our distinguished guests this afternoon. In America and around the globe, democratic institutions have begun to deteriorate. Unfortunately, what's gaining traction are authoritarian movements. Anne Applebaum, journalist and Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, argues in her new book, Twilight of Democracy, that this trend should come as no surprise, given what she calls the seductive lure of authoritarianism. This conversation will be moderated by Max Boot. He is a CNN Global Affairs analyst, Washington Post columnist, and senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome, Max.
Thank you very much, Larry. It's going to be a terrific conversation at a very unusual time in U.S. history and the history of the world. Before jumping in, I just want to invite those listening to share your questions by typing them into the Q&A box and let us know where you're watching from. We'll take as many as we can during the program. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Anne Applebaum. In the Washington Post review of Anne's book, Sherry Berman writes, "Twilight of Democracy offers many lessons on the long-standing struggle between democracy and dictatorship. But perhaps the most important is how fragile democracy is. Its survival depends on choices made every day by elites and ordinary people." And we're here to talk about Anne's book, Twilight of Democracy, which I highly commend to you, not only in the way that Sherry Berman did, but let me just say that just as a reader, I found it to be a very fast, very informal read. I got through it in an afternoon, but it's packed with wisdom and insights, which is exactly what I would expect from Anne, because there is really no writer writing today who I respect more than Anne. So it's a pleasure to be with you again, Anne, and to discuss your important book.
Thank you so much, Max. That's very kind words. And thanks so much to NYU and to the Brennan Center for organizing.
Great. Well, let me start off by talking about the way you start off the book, which is by writing about a party that you had to mark the new millennium on December 31st, 1999. And I believe it was in the very house where you are currently sitting. A much more impressive backdrop, I might add, than the hotel kitchen that I have behind me at the moment. But, you wrote about this in the book as well as in an Atlantic article previously. And it's really something that I think caught people's attentions, because you wrote about how you partied at the end of the 1990s with all of your fellow conservatives, people who believed in classical liberalism in essence, and who felt like their vision had been vindicated by the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Empire. And there was kind of this giddy sense of triumph, of new possibilities, even of history ending, as Frank Fukuyama wrote. And you look back on that from the vantage point of 20 years on, and it seems like a much more dismal picture. And what you point out in the book is that so many of the people who were fellow well-wishers at this party are essentially no longer talking to one another because they have gone in such different directions, with many of them turning out to be illiberal nationalists, conspiracy mongers, anti-Semites, et cetera, and others like you sticking to what you view as being a fairly consistent belief in conservatism, meaning, I guess, essentially classical liberalism. So, I would start off by asking you, what do you think changed? I mean, did these people change, or were they simply not who you thought they were in 1999? Were they always like this, or have they just have they just changed because of changing circumstances over the last couple of decades?
So the book is the answer to that question. I mean, it begins with the party. And let me hasten to explain that I'm not a great hostess and I don't give lots of parties or anything like that. It just seemed like the party is really a metaphor for a group of people, for a kind of group of, not even so much friends, but a group of political associates, people who thought alike and kind of hung around together and now no longer do. And the book is an answer to that question, and I answer it by looking at the same problem in several different places, not just Poland, but also the US, the UK, Spain, with some references to other countries. And there isn't a single answer. It's not a political science book with a sort of big thesis that can be defended. It's from my point of view. It's a subjective view of what happened. And I give different answers for different people. And most of the explanation sooner or later comes down to disappointment. Either people being disappointed with their societies, disappointed with how something turned out, disappointment at a very general level, that they feel their countries are degenerate, or they are going downhill, or they are not as good as they used to be, or they are weaker, or less authentic than they used to be. Or in some cases, it's disappointment with their own personal circumstances. In Poland, there are a number of people who I write about who, for example, expected that the transition from communism to democracy in the 1990s would be personally good for them. And actually, in most cases, it has been good for them. I mean, this is not a book about people who are starving or who are somehow victims of the transition or anything like that. But they weren't quite as successful as they thought they should be. They didn't become prime minister or, best-selling authors. And many of them became very resentful of the system that was created and of the people who were running it, and of the values that it espoused. So the book is about how people then dealt with that disappointment. And the argument is that when you're really disappointed, when you really think your society is dead or declined or undermined or changing in ways that you don't like, then that's one of the paths that sometimes leads to political radicalism. Extreme views often you find them in people who are really quite angry, and they feel that nothing left can be done, that democracy has failed, or the political system has failed, or the elites have failed, or the society has failed, and it needs a radical, dramatic, even violent or disruptive change. And that's the mood that leads people into radicalism. And I trace that path in different ways and how different people have followed it over the last 20 years.
But is it possible that some of those people were kind of radicals or illiberal to begin with, and those differences between them and you were papered over by the Cold War, by the mutual fight against communism? And I'm thinking of people like Solzhenitsyn, who of course was a great hero of the Cold War struggle, not only a great Russian writer, but great Russian dissident, but not a liberal Democrat, somebody who didn't actually believe in the system that you and I hold dear. Do you think that was true of more of those people at the time than you realized?
Yeah, that's certainly true, but I think that's true in the United States as well. All of these anti-communist coalitions everywhere were just that. They were coalitions. And, why were people anti-communist? Look, even if you take the United States, well, so some people were Cold Warriors because of realpolitik, and they were worried about nuclear weapons, and they worried about Soviet influence in Europe and around the world. And that included, by the way, a lot of Democrats. Some people were Cold Warriors because they believed in human rights and democracy, and they believed that democracy was the opposite of communism, and therefore communism had to be fought. Some people were anti-communists or Cold Warriors because they were Christians, and because communism was atheist, and they thought that by engineering the fall of communism, they would spread Christianity, and they expected that to be one of the outcomes of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And one of the things that happened, and I think actually it happened quite fast in the 1990s, if you look across different countries, Poland, the US, the UK, is that those coalitions quite quickly began to break up. And there was a lot of initially disappointment with, in the 1990s in the US and the UK, you had the George Bush Senior administration, you had the John Major administration, and these were run by people who were pragmatic and believed in, okay, now the drama is over, and now it's time to rebuild Europe and put the pieces back together again. And that was a process that for a lot of people was quite boring. I mean, people missed the radical days when they were on the cutting edge of politics, and they were in disagreement with everybody else, and then they proved to be right, and they sought bigger challenges. And that was one of the things that happened in the US. And then actually, as you say, in Eastern Europe, yes, there were a lot of people who were anti-communist, but that didn't mean they were Democrats. It meant that they were nationalists, or they were, or they also had a religious vision of society, and they believed that society should be organized as in Poland around the Catholic Church, or in Russia as around the Orthodox Church. And so yes, very quickly people found that they had great differences. I mean, one of the effects of that in Eastern Europe initially was that in a number of countries, former communists came back to power, and that was very often because the anti-communist opposition turned out to be so fragmented and to have so little unity. So yes, I think you're right. I mean, I think these big coalitions broke up, but I think that's something that just happens every generation or so. We have moments of big change when the coalitions or the things that held people together suddenly seem to break up. I mean, in the book, I talk about a case or a moment in history that probably seems quite remote to most Americans, but it's the moment of the Dreyfus case, the Dreyfus trial in France, which was a moment when a part of the French elite, which had hitherto seemed to have quite a lot in common, the military and the upper levels of society, suddenly broke up and started shouting at one another over the case of Alfred Dreyfus, who was a Jewish officer who was accused of spying, as it turned out, incorrectly. And the society split because it turned out that beneath the surface of an agreement about the the nature of modern France, there were actually quite deep differences, different ideas of what the state should be, whether the state was about an ancient idea of Frenchness connected to old mythology, or whether the state was about justice and equal rights for all. And that broke up France and broke up the sort of French elite at the end of the 19th century. And so maybe it's not surprising that these big political shifts also broke up our alliances or changed what we think the right means or the left means in modern America or modern Europe.
What about your own views? I mean, I think you're very eloquent in tracing the changes in many of your friends, or maybe as Norman Podhoretz would say, ex-friends. But what about your own views? I mean, are you the same person politically and ideologically as you were in 1999, or have you shifted as well? I mean, this is something I grapple with all the time too, because I like to repeat Ronald, because as a former Republican, I think we're both former Republicans, although you earlier than me. I like to repeat Ronald Reagan's line about I didn't leave my party left me, but I'm not sure that's 100% accurate, because I feel like my views have shifted in some matters as well. And I'm just wondering, what about you? Because you don't talk too much about your own views in the book.
I mean, my own views I find less interesting than the views of other people. Maybe that's the explanation.
I find your views interesting, though.
So, I'm glad someone does. Yes, I mean, I in essence, I feel the same way as you, that my principles are still the same, and the reasons why I was an anti-communist remain the same as now. And I was one of the people who was interested in democratization and human rights, and that was what I thought was at stake in the 1980s and early 1990s. But I also think that any intelligent person, and I think on the left and the right this is true, changes their views as circumstances change. There's that famous quote from Kennan, which is, when the facts change, I change my views. What do you do? And I do feel like life throws up different circumstances and new problems, and not all of your old frame of mind fits the new problem, and not all of the ways that you thought in the 1980s or 1990s are appropriate to 2020. And so, yeah, I probably have changed what I think about some things. I mean, on some basic levels, clearly one of the solutions in 1989, one of the solutions to the catastrophe of communism in Eastern Europe was the import of free markets, or the construction of the conditions for free markets and the conditions for entrepreneurship and capitalism, which actually have in much of the region, at least in the European, the piece of the ex-communist bloc that's now part of the European Union, in much of the region has been a great success. In Poland, where I am right now, it was a great success. That doesn't mean, though, that you can keep screaming markets, markets, markets. The markets are the answer to everything forever. And there have to be some other solutions for different times. I mean, clearly we're at a moment when people are now much more willing to give economic power to the state. I'm thinking of the moment of the coronavirus, which has suddenly and unfairly robbed people of their livelihoods. And it seems like this is a good moment for the state to step in. I mean, how that's done and whether it can be done fairly and whether it can be done without creating too much debt and too much trouble down the road is a different question. But I mean, clearly you have to adjust your views. I mean, to be a market fanatic at this moment in history would be to just ignore what's going on. But there are also other issues. There are other causes that have that have emerged and appear different to me now than they used to. Here in Poland, for example, the cause of gay rights and the cause of gay marriage is not an issue. It wasn't that I've changed my views about it. It just wasn't, to me, an issue that seemed central to politics or something that I needed to editorialize or worry about. But here in Poland, the government has made this into a really important wedge issue, and has tried. And during the most recent presidential election here, literally tried to polarize the country around this issue. Are you for or against something they call LGBT ideology? And this is an ideology which they say has nothing to do with people. It's an ideology worse than communism. And they've tried to create a kind of anti-gay homophobic coalition, mostly based on ignorance and people, not knowing much about the subject, or they create fear with crazy radical looking pictures and photographs, and they scare people, and they imply that, if you accept LGBT ideology, then you can't be Catholic anymore, and so on. So they've used it as a wedge issue. And this now seems to me something that is really central here and has to be fought. So in a way, the issues present themselves differently, and they have different weight, perhaps, than they used to. And I think the other thing that's important is that many of the, anybody who sticks to a rigid set of ideas, or a rigid set of solutions to problems, will find that those solutions no longer match the situation at some point. But that doesn't mean, returning to your own view, my party left me, that doesn't mean that very basic or fundamental commitments have to be lost. And I would say that I'm still fundamentally committed to a society in which there is an even playing field in politics, in which, there are independent courts, in which there are separations of powers, in which there are some forms of independent media that are not either dependent on the state or dependent on oligarchs with close connections to the state. So there are certain fundamental rules that I would say I haven't changed on, but how the issues present themselves and the importance that they have, I think that has changed in my head over time, and I think it should.
Have you changed your views on whether democracy is destined to triumph? I mean, I can't speak for you, but I feel like we were both basically part of the generation of 1989, coming of age as the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc were collapsing. And I think that led to a certain, I can't speak for you, I'll speak for me. That led to a certain triumphalism and giddiness on my part, where Frank Fukuyama's The End of History seemed fairly plausible, that in fact, liberal democracy was the end the final destination of this centuries-long ideological struggle. And it sure doesn't feel like that right now. In fact, obviously, your book is called The Twilight of Democracy. So I'm just curious, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, but have you gone from being, super optimistic about democracy to being super pessimistic? Is that accurate?
I've certainly, I mean, that is what my book is about. It's about the loss of certainty and the loss of, exactly that sense that, there's something inevitable about democracy. But I actually think that feeling of inevitability, that it has to be that way, that history is progressive and it unfolds in a certain manner. And of course, that's that's of course a caricature of what most people thought. I mean, it was clear from the beginning.
The Whig view of history.
Yeah, but it was clear, even in the 90s, it was clear that it wasn't going to be smooth sailing. I mean, it was clear to me that Russia wasn't going to be a democracy quite early on, for example. And in fact, my party opens on, December 31st, 1999, which is also the day that Boris Yeltsin resigned and Putin began what would be the beginning of a 2 decades long and power. So even at that moment, it was becoming clear. So I don't want to oversimplify what people thought, but certainly this feeling of inevitability was a mistake. And it was a mistake not only because it was, it made us predict the future incorrectly, but also because I think it gave people a sense of complacency particularly about our own democracy, about American democracy, about West European democracy, and not just about the new democracies of Eastern Europe, newish, they're not so new anymore. And that feeling of complacency, I think, meant that for a lot of people, they kind of checked out of politics starting in the 1990s. Well, politics is something that professionals do. We don't have to worry about it. It'll somehow manage itself. We don't need to vote. We don't need to be members of parties. We don't need to be part of civic institutions. We don't have to worry about get out the vote campaigns. There's someone who will do that. There's some kind of professional caste or class who will do it. And I think that was a major mistake because that was one of the reasons why people's faith in democracy began to weaken. And it was one of the reasons why democracy in the US in particular was taken over and began to be harmed by these, just torrents of spending and by lobbyists and special interests who sought to twist it in various ways, and that which then undermined people's faith in it further. So in fact, one of the things I hope to achieve with the book is it's a kind of clarion call, reminder to people, don't be complacent. Democracies do fail. And in fact, all democracies in the past have failed. And, even most of the ones that exist now are very recent. Ours is a couple of hundred years old. It's one of the oldest. By some, it depends how you want to compare us to Great Britain, but by some measures, it is the oldest. And most of the ones around are far more recent. And, we've seen democracy collapse multiple times. We've seen it collapse many times in South America over the last several decades. We saw it collapse in Europe in the 1930s. Many European democracies that we think of as fairly stable today are quite recent. Not forget Eastern Europe. It's Spain and Greece became democracies in the 1970s, which is not so long ago. And keeping that in mind and remembering that, politics is really cyclical rather than progressive, that it doesn't go in one direction, it can go in many directions, and that there's no law that says once you've had a democracy for X numbers of years, you'll always have one. I think that's a good reminder, especially for Americans who have the sense of, that our democracy is somehow inevitable or guaranteed.
Let me press you a little bit more on the title of your book and the thesis of your book. And you've said repeatedly that it's not a strongly thesis-driven book, but let me just ask you about the title, because I notice it is called Twilight of Democracy and it doesn't have a question mark. And at some points in the book, you seem fairly pessimistic about the outlook for democracy, where you write, for example, on page 14, given the right conditions, any society can turn against democracy. Indeed, if history is anything to go by, all of our societies eventually will. And yet, by the end of the book, by page 185, while you say that we may be doomed, like glittering multi-ethnic Habsburg Vienna or creative decadent Weimar Berlin, to be swept away into irrelevance, it is possible that we are already living through the twilight of democracy, that our civilization may be heading for anarchy or tyranny, and so forth and so on. But then you write, or maybe the coronavirus will inspire a new sense of global solidarity. Maybe we will renew and modernize our institutions. Do you have at this point in time, and I realize the story remains very much unfinished, but I mean, which way are you leaning? Is this actually the twilight of democracy or not?
So first of all, I don't do predictions. Second of all, one of the conclusions I came to while writing the book, actually, is that it is irresponsible for people in my generation to be pessimistic and to say it's the end, it's all over, because that is unfair to people who are 20 and 30 years younger than us, who are just beginning their lives and their careers, and who have a chance to change things and make them better. I mean, the book is really a warning rather than a prediction. It is, it points out that democracies do die. It shows and indicates how some of them could die. It points out that, some die and then are revived, and, history has been circular in many places, and there are countries that have, like Greece, that have gone back and forth between democracy and dictatorship over many decades. But ultimately it points out that there is no way to predict the future, and decisions that are made now, both by people in power and by people who are younger, can affect the outcome. We can revive democracy. We can bring it back. We can change the way its rules works. We have the power, for example, to eliminate the flows of money that go in our democracy. We have the power to eliminate flows of dirty money around the world. We could end tax shelters tomorrow by making them illegal. We have the power to change things, and I hope that the book inspires younger people to see that. So Max is frozen. So I'm guessing that's a question about where the threat to democracy emanates from, or perhaps what's the appeal of authoritarianism. I mean, look, there is a part of every society. There's a part of humanity. I mean, this is something else that I write about in the book, that is naturally skeptical or wary of moments when there is a great deal of change, that dislikes the cacophony and noise of democracy, that dislikes loud exchanges between people, that prefers something more stable, something more consistent, something more predictable. And in fact, it's interesting because I think Max's questions, what's the future? What's the answer? For a lot of people, the uncertainty of the future, and in particular, the uncertainty of is always uncertain. You never know the outcome. It often feels fragile and unstable. And the uncertainty of this kind of political system is bothersome and difficult and distressing even. And there are some people for whom an alternative would be preferable, whether that's an alternative, whether that's a one-party state, or whether it's a single leader, or whether it's even just a democracy in which the rules are suspended so that there's not so much noise and debate. We've seen in a number of European countries over the last several years that there are people who are delighted when some of their compatriots are unable to vote or who are frozen out of the political process. We even have the spectacle in America today of some people not being distressed by Americans being unable to vote, or by the post office being damaged by decisions taken by the administration. That seems to them right and fair, because they prefer that only people like them, or only people who agree with them, have the right to vote. And they find that to be upsetting.
Well, is it fair to say that the threat today emanates primarily from the right, or is there also a threat to the left? I guess from the left. I guess another way to put that is, how concerned are you about quote unquote cancel culture, which has become kind of a buzz phrase on the right, been picked up even by President Trump, who's in no position to talk about intolerance, but he constantly accuses liberals of being intolerant, of wanting to cancel everybody who doesn't agree with them, et cetera, et cetera. Is this a real danger, or is it just camouflaging the threat and trying to distract us from the threat that comes from right-wing intolerance of the kind which is in power from Warsaw to Washington?
So I'm asked this question a lot, and I think I think I'm allowed to speak about it because I have written 3 books about left-wing dictatorship, about Stalinism, about post-war Eastern Europe, communist Eastern Europe. I have written extensively about Marxism and the danger of that ideology. I'm very well aware of the way in which Marxism has evolved into new forms, and it's available on college campuses. I do think that the atmosphere, again, in some universities, not all universities actually, but some universities, or rather some departments of some universities, because biochemical engineering is not usually afflicted, and the way in which that atmosphere, that stifling of debate, the rules about what people are and aren't allowed to say in public discussions, some of those rules have moved into other spheres, into parts of the media, into other walks of life. I think all of that is extremely bad. It's negative, it's worrying, but I don't think it compares to the kind of danger that's posed to the United States and to American institutions from right-wing, so-called right-wing authoritarianism. In fact, it's a kind of kleptocratic authoritarianism that is now currently in power. The Trumpist version of the Republican Party, which is so different from the Republican Party of even 5 years ago, sees the state and the institutions of the state as instruments that it can use to enrich itself and its members, or to enhance the political careers and fortunes of its members. Remember, we have a president who used tools of American foreign policy, so military aid to an American ally, in Ukraine, used that money, or tried to use it as a bribe to convince a foreign government to launch a fake investigation of his political rival. I mean, take a step back from that. That would have been sort of unthinkable in any U.S. administration in living memory. I mean, I can't speak for every White House in the 19th century, but certainly there's none who you can remember in recent times who would have done such a thing. And the instrumentalization, the use of the state for the personal and political needs of the ruling party and of some of the president, of the president's family, is absolutely unprecedented and poses a danger to American democracy of a kind that I don't think we've seen. And to me, when the left poses that kind of problem, when there's a left-wing party in power that behaves that way and abuses the state that way, then I'll worry about it as well, and I'll raise the same kinds of alarms. But for me, this is not a moment of symmetry. These are not equal problems. They are both problems, but they are not equal problems.
Now, for some reason, it seems like the only place where left-wing populists consistently come to power is Latin America, and we can debate why that is. But I want to ask you about the role of social media. And you had a very interesting story a few days ago in the Atlantic about this 22-year-old from Belarus who has been organizing protests, even though he's in exile, and using a web app to do that. And of course, there's a long history over the last 20 years. I mean, we've seen that with the Arab Spring and color revolutions all over the world, where they've been organized on social media. And so I think there was kind of a sense in the 1990s and for years after that the rise of the internet would be this great tool of democratization and would lead to the overthrow of dictatorships. And of course, in more recent years, we've seen that dictatorships in places like the United States, I was about to say the United States, we're not yet a dictatorship, but in places like Russia or China, those dictatorships are actually quite adept at censoring the internet. And what we're seeing in the United States, of course, as well as in other countries, is the way that illiberal movements spread disinformation online. And of course, that's been a central story of Donald Trump's rise to the presidency. So, I guess my question is social media a danger or a boost for democracy, or both? And which way do you think it's going to shake out?
So social media, like any media, is neutral in that, it can be used by different people in different ways. It's sort of neither good nor bad. I mean, it's like asking whether, TV is good or bad. I mean, TV, you can do fantastic things on television and, amazing creative documentaries, or you can put out, reality television garbage 24 hours a day. And social media is a little bit like that, in that it's a reflection of how people speak and talk to one another. And both the best of humanity and the worst of humanity can be found on social media. And social media has clearly been used to organize people in an empowering way, and it's been used to divide people in a disempowering way. Much depends on which channels are being used and who's using them. In my book, I do talk about the ways in which the authoritarians have sought to use social media, which is interestingly almost the opposite of the way the Belarusian I wrote about last week is using them. Namely, they have sought to use social media as a tool of division in order to create wedge issues and also to create a sense of fear and to create senses of us versus them community online. We need to hang together to protect ourselves against the rest of the evil society. And so, again, it's a tool that can be used either way. I mean, there are a number of ways in which some forms of social media, and particularly Facebook, but also actually even YouTube and Twitter, have been certainly have been used to increase extremism. The way their algorithms work is that they try and get people staying online as long as possible. They tend to show people or guide people in ever more extreme directions. So, I mean, this has been shown over and over again. People who begin by being interested in their pets can then get led into animal rights websites, and from there can be led into extreme animal rights terrorism. And you can sort of if you follow the recommendations on YouTube, you can get into more and more extreme views. And so there is a national conversation, I think, that needs to be held about whether we want social media to do that, and should there be some insight into these algorithms and transparency about how they work. And is it, given that that's increasingly the way in which people get their information, don't we want there to be some input from the entire society about what the rules are? So I think social media can be very destructive or it can be very constructive. It depends how it's used. It depends what the rules are. I mean, certainly I think we can say that it's very, it's undermining of whatever current system is in place. Any media revolution, whether it was the invention of the printing press at the beginning of the Reformation, or whether it was the invention of radio in the early 20th century, anytime there's a new system of information or people getting information in different ways, there's always a political revolution that follows. And I think that's really what we're in the middle of now. So certainly it is bringing change. It changes the way in which people hear things and understand things. It changes their relationship to people in power. And that can be both for better and for worse.
All right, we have about 20 minutes left in our program, so I want to turn it over to audience questions at this point. And let me begin with the first one, which is asking about, to what extent has there been open dialogue between pro-democracy movements around the world? For example, in Southeast Asian countries like Thailand, democracy activists today are teaching Hong Kong tactics. Has there been more coordination in recent years between democracy movements? And let me also ask you, the flip side of the question is there also more coordination between dictatorships? Are dictatorships also working together to stymie freedom fighters? And some people have spoken about an illiberal international with these populist movements, many of them backed by Russia. So the question is about the international aspect and the coordination between both the pro-democratic and the anti-democratic forces.
So yes, absolutely. I think I once wrote a column with a headline. It was either the illiberal international or the alt-right international. I've forgotten now which it was, but I think both are absolutely true. In the way, of course, and remembering, of course, that they've always been true. So what happened in 1989, which was a pre-internet, pre-social media era, was that people, in one Eastern European country saw the revolution happening next door and imitated it or imitated aspects of it. And actually you can look back at 1848 and, or other revolutionary moments in history, or other indeed authoritarian movements in history. And you can often see countries copying one another or importing ideas. So ideas have always moved very fast from country to country. But you asked specifically about whether dissidents are helping one another. The answer to that is yes. There is some cases it's voluntarily. There are some groups that go out of their way to make that happen, to make that, there are people who have dedicated themselves to explicitly trying to learn the lessons of what makes a successful nonviolent movement, for example, or a successful street demonstration, and they have tried to spread that knowledge from one place to the next. And by the same token, and this again is in my book, there is no question that both authoritarians learn from one another, learn technologies from one another. In some cases, this is explicit. China explicitly, for example, exports its form of social credit. So its form of social control, which uses social media and uses the internet and uses spy cameras and all kinds of things, it is explicitly exporting that to other countries and teaching them how to do it. So that is absolutely happening. But it's also, the sort of illiberal international is also functions in a different way, which is that there are online activists who copy one another's style and techniques, and sometimes even literally repost their memes and their jokes, which works also across borders. So there is something like an international alt-right, which takes some cues from the US and some cues from Europe, and sometimes organizes itself even spontaneously around themes and ideas. There was a moment, I write about this in the book, there was a moment when, if you remember the fire at Notre Dame some months ago, this was a moment that led to a whole series of across European, alt-right, far-right, memes and arguments where people began to say, there was a whole conspiracy theory that Muslims had set it on fire, or that it was a curse from God about the end of Christianity in the West, and so on. And those ideas were repeated and reposted in multiple languages, almost in real time, and it happened very fast. So these are now movements that can coalesce around particular moments or pictures or videos and pass them on quite quickly. So one of the ironies of this moment actually is that although it is a kind of nationalist moment when nationalism is enjoying a revival in a lot of countries, it's also a moment when it's really never been so clear that ideas are international and that they're fungible, and that ways of organizing in Thailand or Hong Kong or Belarus can be passed from country to country. And the openness of the internet actually, makes possible both versions of it. As I said, it makes possible both a kind of, positive exchange of how to use nonviolence constructively, and it makes possible the knowledge of how to create, fear and hatred and more social division.
Next question. What's inspired the reaction against liberalism in the United States and Europe? Are elites leading this, or are they following popular cues?
That's a chicken and egg question. It's a bit of both. I think there is a There is a lot of disillusion in the United States. You can go back to the financial crisis, which is a moment when a lot of people lost faith in, the idea that many had that people in power, at least, they may not know a lot, but at least they know how to run financial markets in the United States. And this was quite powerful, actually, outside of the US, around the world. Faith in American leadership really was damaged at that moment. You can also look to the feeling that many had that they were left out of the arguments in the 1990s, and that the economic changes and demographic changes didn't include them, or they weren't consulted. And so some of that disillusion and sense that we're not heard or our voices aren't heard does come from the bottom. But again, one of the things I argue in the book is that much of that disillusion has also been packaged and formed and sold by elites. So by, right-wing intellectuals, or far-right intellectuals, or makers of memes, or presenters on Fox News, or people who've thought long and hard about how to package and sell and promote that sense of alienation or that sense of fear, how to make people angrier, and how to make people more discontent, and how to prepare people, therefore, for more radicalism. And then, of course, there's a feedback loop whereby the efforts of the elites creates more alienation on the ground, and then the alienation on the ground feeds the demand for the fear and anger that you see on Fox News. I don't think you can point to one another. I think they feed into one another, and both are important. But normally the way political reporting works is everybody wants to know what the voters think. Which, and of course that's where any argument about politics has to begin. But very often the role played by elites, and by which I mean right-wing elites, or radical elites, or extremist elites, is overlooked and forgotten, because they also have a role in channeling and formulating and giving voice to a certain kind of negative energy.
Next question. Very succinct. Could it happen here? Is it happening here? Did it already happen here? So basically asking, what is the status of democracy in the United States? How endangered is it?
So I do believe it is deeply endangered. I believe we are at a critical moment. I believe that this is a very critical election. I believe there are now people inside the Republican Party who are thinking about how to cheat, how to make sure that they don't lose, even against what appear to be the odds. Although of course those odds in the polls could change between now and November. They're thinking about how to undermine the post office, as I've said, to prevent people from voting. They're thinking about how to spin the coronavirus to prevent people from voting, and the story of the coronavirus. And I think there are more and more people in power who are trying to figure out how to use the organs of the state, to preserve power or to benefit themselves. And the way to, and these are, the language that's being used and the divisive tactics are very difficult to stop. We've seen in a number of other countries, anti-populist or movements have often not succeeded because the appeal of a message of unity, or a message of niceness, or a message of let's all be together, let's not be divided. Sometimes the appeal of that kind of message is just less powerful than the appeal of fear and anger and hatred and division. And so one of the things I worry about in the upcoming election is that the center, by which I mean the Democrats and a part of the Republican Party, will fail to find language that's powerful enough to counter the language of fear and anger and exaggeration. We are lucky in the United States that we're such a big country and we're such a decentralized country. We don't have an interior ministry, although we had the little glimmerings of what one might look like when we saw this sort of strange camouflage wearing troops sent to Portland a few weeks ago. We don't have an interior ministry. We don't have, we're not a centralized state. Washington doesn't control the police in every state. It doesn't control the voting systems in every state. It doesn't control the media in every state the way in some much smaller countries, in Hungary, something like 95% of the media is now one way or another controlled by the government. And we have, in that sense, our size and our great variety are a kind of bulwark against authoritarianism, as are courts, and the division of power. But it's a dangerous moment. I mean, the Trump administration has shown how much of what we thought was kind of baked in, many of the rules that we thought held weren't really rules, or they weren't really laws. They were sort of norms, accepted ways in which things are done. For example, the norm that a president publishes his tax information and his financial information so that we can see whether he's influenced by his personal interests. Trump broke that norm and has appeared to pay no price for it. And numerous other norms, over the past 3.5 years have also been broken and at apparently no cost. And that should lead us to question whether our assumptions about the solidity of our democracy and the solidity of our rules are really whether those assumptions were a little too optimistic. So I mean, I don't think democracy in America is over. I think in a lot of ways it's very lively, but it's proved to be weaker in some ways than we thought it was.
Next question. In the United States, will elements of Trumpism outlast Trump and the Republican Party? Is the national conservatism of Josh Hawley going to be dominant in the party? And obviously not just Josh Hawley, but Tom Cotton, Marco Rubio, and others struggling to create something that would be Trumpism post-Trump. And that gets directly to the point that you were just addressing about the danger to democracy in the United States. What's going to happen with the Republican Party? Is it going to become an illiberal, nationalist, racist, white supremacist party in perpetuity?
So I think a lot depends on the outcome of the election, by which I mean it's not just about whether Trump loses. It's about how much he loses by, what happens in the Senate, what happens in the House, what happens at other down ballot races. I think if Republicans continue to believe that this is a winning tactic, that this kind of strange white nationalism plus plus fake populism, which in fact benefits the wealthy rather than the poor, whether this kind of language continues to be popular, whether it continue to win votes. I think if they become convinced of that, then I think, yes, it will survive. And I think you've just given us a list of the people who could be its next leaders, and I would add some to that list. I would add members of the Trump family, Don Trump Jr. I would add Tucker Carlson. I would add other, non-political figures who might emerge from the woodwork and try and become leaders now that Trump has proved that that's possible. So I think watch very carefully what happens after the election, if the election is lost, which of course there's no guarantee it will be. But if it's lost, what happens afterwards and what conclusions people draw. If they think that they can't win with these kinds of tactics, then we'll find perhaps a different kind of republicanism, one designed to repeal, at the very least, designed to appeal to the entire country, rather than a narrow base. We'll find perhaps that returning.
Next question. Besides voting, what is the most important thing individuals can do to stop those intent on authoritarianism from winning the day?
I think the most important thing to do is to join civic organizations. If you don't want to join a political party or you don't want to work for a political party, then work for or join or help a Get Out the Vote campaign, or even participate somehow in your local or neighborhood politics. I think being part of public conversation, being on the school board or being in the PTA or being in some way a participant in things that we all design jointly is really the best way to contribute. And you can have as much influence, as much impact at a very narrow local level as you can at the national level. And that's been shown, those are the real building blocks of our democracy have always been since de Tocqueville first wrote about them, in the 19th century, have always been these associations, these groups, these organizations of people who seek to make change in their communities, for their societies. And I think some kind of public participation is the best thing that you can do.
Do you feel like, and this might be our final question, do you feel like the participation that so many people have on places like Twitter and Facebook and other social media, is it helpful or hurtful or both? Because it just seems like the more the public gets involved and the less the gatekeepers matter, the more vitriolic the debate has become in many ways.
So I think social media is a kind of substitution for real participation.
Okay.
It's not real, by clicking something or by talking to people online, you aren't actually participating. I say that this is such an odd moment when so much has to happen online because of the pandemic. But if it's over, when it's over, and I hope it will someday be over, being part of, real groups that do things offline is also really important. And making sure that you have sources of information and sources of connection to people that aren't just via random Facebook or Twitter connections is extremely important. Putting time into real organizations and real institutions, that's, I think, how democracy is built, rather than by scrolling through things on your phone, tempting though that, of course, is for all of us to do.
Well said, even though I feel like I personally spend way too much time scrolling through my Twitter feed. Well, on that note, thanks to Anne Applebaum for joining me in this discussion. I wish you the best of luck with your new book, Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. I hope that everybody listening today goes out and buys the book. It's not very costly and it doesn't take a long time to read. And I think it really rewards a close read. Thank you to Larry Norden and all the folks at the Brennan Center for Justice, NYU's Bradamus Center, NYU Votes, who produced this program. I'm Max Boot. Thank you for joining us.